William Shakespeare once wrote, "Some people are born great, others achieve greatness, and still others have greatness thrust upon them." And when it comes to the Hebrew liberator Moses, I think all three of those are true. Perhaps no person in history outside of Jesus himself has made such a profound impression on the world as Moses. And I mean, you know his story. Anyone who's heard it, it becomes as familiar as your own living room. A baby placed in a basket and set adrift down a dangerous river, discovered by an Egyptian princess and raised in Pharaoh's palace, only to discover that he was meant for so much more. Moses delivered an oppressed people from bondage and molded them into a new nation and received a revelation from God with new moral standards and laws. In Jewish minds, Moses ranked among the most respected Old Testament figures. And because he received the law, including the Ten Commandments, directly from God on Mount Sinai, he's always been closely associated in both Jewish and Christian minds with the commands and customs and ceremonies of that Old Covenant. And yet Moses himself was unequivocally a man of faith. Moses' faith was the catalyst for national change and a spiritual awakening in the lives of the children of Israel. He led hundreds of thousands of Hebrews out of slavery and became a hero to the people, a national icon. His story is one of doubt and deliverance, humility and heartbreak, conflict and courage, trials and triumphs. And it's a story that remains as relevant and relatable today as it was 30-some centuries ago. And so this morning I'd like to invite you to join me for the next few weeks for a fast-paced survey of the life of Moses. With any luck, we'll learn some life lessons along the way. And when I say fast-paced, I do mean it, because this morning I want to look at the first 80 years of Moses' life. The Bible tells us that Moses lived to be 120. And so these first 80 years are really just laying the groundwork for what would become an amazing life of boldness and belief in God. His story begins in the first few chapters of Exodus. So if you've got a Bible with you, go ahead and open it to Exodus chapter 1, a paper Bible or an app on your phone, either one. And it begins there with Moses' rescue. You probably remember that the Hebrew people migrated to Egypt during the days of Joseph. And although Joseph was Hebrew by birth, he was sold as a slave in Egypt and eventually rose to this place of prominence. In fact, he was Pharaoh's right-hand man, the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. And so when the severe famine swept through the land, Joseph sent for his entire family. He reunited with them and brought all of the sons of Israel, their children and grandchildren, a total of 70 people, to make their home in the prosperous and plentiful land of Egypt. But Exodus begins by telling us in verses 6 through 8, in time, Joseph and all of his brothers died, ending that entire generation. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. See, the descendants of Israel still lived in the land of Egypt, and their population exploded, so much so that they became like a nation unto themselves. And Pharaoh, this new Pharaoh, feared what might happen if the Hebrews ever turned against the Egyptians. Say there's a war or some civil unrest and they decide to side against us. How could we fight against so many people? And so the Bible says in verse 11, the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. The Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all of the work in the fields and build their pyramids. They were ruthless in their demands. However, the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more babies the Israelites had, and the more their population grew, and the more the Egyptians became concerned. And so Pharaoh issued a royal decree to all the people of Egypt, saying in verse 22, "Every time a boy is born to the Hebrews, you must throw him into the Nile River." Hundreds, maybe even thousands of baby Hebrew boys, beautiful, precious little babies, were thrown into the Nile River and drowned, disappeared, washed away by the water. But one survived. This unnamed Hebrew woman gave birth to a precious brown-eyed baby boy, and she hid him from the Egyptian authorities for about 3 months. But at that point, he had gotten so big and vocal that she thought she couldn't hide him anymore. So she concocted a plan. The Bible says in verse 3 through 4 of chapter 2, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it in among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen to him. So soon as this basket sits along the riverbank, Pharaoh's daughter, the princess of Egypt, came to bathe in the river. And she's surrounded by all of these attendants, and she spots the basket among the reeds. She sends one of her attendants over to retrieve it. She opens it up, looks inside, and she sees this adorable little baby boy, and he's crying, and her heart just melts. She knows immediately that this must be one of the Hebrew babies. Somebody was trying to rescue him. And just then, his sister comes out of hiding and approaches the princess. And thinking quickly, she asked, "Should I go find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Well, yes, do," the princess says. And so the little girl, Miriam, runs home and gets her mom and brings her back to the princess. And the princess offers to pay the baby's mom to nurse him until he's old enough to come and live at the palace. And so not only did this woman save her baby's life, but now she's getting paid to take care of her own son. And the princess names the baby Moses, which means lifted up or rescued, because she rescued him from the river. And as I read this story, it seems to me that Moses' mother planned for the princess to discover and adopt Moses. You know, we often get this picture a little confused in our minds. We have this image of this little basket just kind of floating down the river like it's on some, whitewater rafting trip down the Nile. But that's not what the Bible says. It says it was placed along the riverbank in the reeds. It was stuck in those reeds. It wasn't going anywhere. And it was still in those reeds when the princess discovered it. And so Moses' mom knew what she was doing. She placed it where she knew it would be discovered. And my guess is that she knew this was the princess's favorite place to come and swim in the Nile. But even if this wasn't part of her plan, it was certainly part of God's plan. Moses' dramatic rescue demonstrated that God and his mom had a carefully crafted plan for Moses' life. Now, the truth is, he's got a plan for your life too, and mine. And who could forget the unforgettable words of Jeremiah 29:11, which says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." Now, it's as if God just whispered those words to Moses as he sat there in that little basket. And he's whispered the same words to us. God's plotting for our good. In all of the setbacks and all of the trials that we experience in life, he's ordaining the best for our future. You are in the hands of the living, loving God. Your life is this crafted narrative written by a good God working toward your supreme good. God's not just making up these plans as he goes along, and nor did he just wind up the clock and then, walk away. God's purpose, plan, and promise is to work out the events of human history and your life in particular for the good, to give you hope and a future. a future with him and Jesus for all eternity. But this is just the beginning. Following his rescue, the Bible flashes forward many years to Moses' rejection. The second part of this story is Moses rejected. After weaning Moses, his mother then turns him over to the princess of Egypt, who adopts him and raises him in the palace amidst all of this, wealth and luxury. But at some point, maybe during his childhood or his early adulthood, Moses learned that he was adopted. And his heart went out to his fellow Hebrews who were not as prosperous and pampered as he was. The Bible says in chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. Now we can sympathize with Moses' outrage. We can understand his motives. He witnesses oppression and violence. His people are being brutally beaten and they can't fight back. He just wanted to protect them. But none of that justifies Moses taking matters into his own hands and committing murder. Now, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a heated argument that got out of hand. He paused. He made sure there were no witnesses first, murdered the man, and then hid the body. He knew it was wrong before he did it, but he thought he could get away with it anyway. The next day, however, when he came back to visit his people again, Moses saw two Hebrews fighting amongst themselves. And when he tried to break the fight up, one of them shouts at him in verse 14, "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" All of a sudden, just imagine that sinking feeling in his stomach when he heard this. Moses' mind reels and he starts thinking, everybody knows what I did. And the Bible says in verse 15, the next verse, sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. This whole episode resulted in rejection for Moses. He was rejected by his own people who he thought he was trying to help them, but they just saw him as this pampered priest that thought he could get away with murder, or this pampered prince, that is, that thought he could get away with murder. And then he was rejected by his own family. This Pharaoh, it's uncertain of the timeline here, but this would have either been his uncle or his father, who was Pharaoh at this time. And yet he's chased and trying to flee his own death sentence, and he has to leave the country. He became a stranger in a strange land, separated from his home and his family. And sometimes like Moses, we mistakenly think that we can get away with doing wrong if no one sees us or catches us. Sooner or later, though, our sin will catch up with us. And when we do something wrong, and especially when we hurt other people, we often experience loneliness. We may feel abandoned or isolated because of the things that we've done. But we shouldn't give up. Moses didn't. He ran. He started over. It took years after this incident before Moses was ready to serve God. But as he began building a new life in Midian, he trusted God no matter how dark his past or how bleak his future. And it's good that he did, because the next chapter tells us about God recruiting Moses for a world-changing mission. That's the third and last part of his story that we'll look at this morning, is Moses recruited. 40 years passed while Moses carved out a life in Midian. He met and married a young woman named Zipporah. They had children. Moses made his living as a shepherd, which, by the way, in the eyes of the Egyptians was like the lowest possible profession. What a humbling experience this must have been for him. As an Egyptian prince, he had everything he ever wanted. He had everything brought to him on a silver platter. Everything was done for him by his servants. As a shepherd in Midian, he had to do everything himself. He had very little. He had to work hard for what he had. He may not have realized it at the time, but God was getting him ready to free Israel from Pharaoh's grasp. And meanwhile, the king of Egypt died, and a new Pharaoh took his place. So this would have either been Moses' brother or a cousin who was also raised in Pharaoh's household. And the Bible says that the Israelites continued to groan under this burden of slavery. And we read in verse 23 and 25 of chapter 2, they cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groanings, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. And so about that time, Moses was tending his flock near Mount Sinai. And suddenly this flickering light catches Moses' eye, and he turns to see this blazing fire in the middle of a bush, and Moses just stares in amazement. Even though the dancing flames engulfed the entire bush, it wasn't burning up. And so as Moses moves closer to investigate, a commanding voice emanates from the bush. And it says in Exodus 3, verse 5 and 6, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Both amazed and afraid, Moses removes his sandals and hides his face because he's just overwhelmed by this experience. And once God had Moses' full and undivided attention, he shared a message with him that would change the course of Moses' life. God announces in verse 9 and 10, "Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I've seen how harshly the Egyptians abused them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt." And I love this passage because it reminds us that God sees what's happening down here on earth. He's not blind to it. He's fully aware of all the suffering and the struggles that people experience. He knows about school shootings and civil unrest and lost and lonely people who feel forgotten and abandoned. And his solution, his answer to the plight of suffering on this planet is the same today as it was then. He told Moses, "I am sending you." God helps people through people. And at first, Moses protested to God. He said, "Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? You've got the wrong guy, God. I'm not cut out for this." Moses made excuses because he felt inadequate for the job that God called him to do. And it was natural for him to feel that way. I mean, he was inadequate all by himself. But God wasn't asking Moses to work alone. God answered all of Moses' objections, saying in verse 12, "I will be with you." God often calls us to tasks that seem too difficult, but he doesn't ask us to do them alone. God goes with us. He enables us and empowers us to do what he asks us to do. He empowered Moses by giving him the ability to perform these mighty miracles, starting with his staff. And I've always found this part of the story interesting. God turns to Moses and he says, "What's that in your hand?" As if God doesn't know what's in Moses' hand, right? And Moses looks and he says, it's my shepherd's staff. And God tells him to throw the staff on the ground. And so he does, and it turns into this massive snake, and Moses just jumps back like he's terrified of it. But God tells him to grab the snake by the tail, and I can just imagine how timidly, he's like, "I don't know about this, God," but he eventually grabs it by the tail, and instantly it turns back into his staff. And And he was told to show this to Pharaoh. And then later he uses this same staff to part the Red Sea and to strike a rock and water comes pouring out of it. A shepherd's staff was pretty common. I mean, it was just a 6-foot-long wooden rod with a curved hook at the top. Shepherds used them for walking and guiding the sheep, kind of pulling them back on track when they wander off and fending off snakes and other animals that might attack the sheep, and among other things. But it was just a stick. I mean, God used the simple shepherd's staff that Moses carried to teach him an important lesson. God can use ordinary things for extraordinary purposes. And the same is true in your life and mine. We've all got ordinary things in our lives, don't we? Your voice, a pen, a hammer, a broom, musical instrument, and the list is infinite. Little did Moses imagine the power of his simple staff, the power it would wield when it was used in God's name. And God still recruits ordinary men and women to do extraordinary things. Just imagine what God could accomplish through you if you'd answer his call. I think we learn a lot from the life of Moses. His Nile River rescue teaches us that God has a plan for each one of us, and he works things out so that we're in just the right place at the right time. Moses' rejection by Pharaoh and by the people of Israel show us that sin, doing the wrong thing, even for the right reason, has consequences. It often isolates us and pushes us away from the people we care about. But his recruitment by God reminds us that we have a God of second chances. And no matter how badly we mess up, no matter how inadequate we might feel, God will empower and enable us to do extraordinary things if we'll simply stop making excuses and answer his call. And the amazing thing is Moses' story is just getting started. Next week, we'll watch and learn as Moses confronts Pharaoh and says those unforgettable words, "Let my people go." In the meantime, if you know God is calling you, whether he's calling you to ministry, or he's calling you to put your faith and your trust in him, or he's calling you to something else entirely, let me encourage you to stop making excuses. Trust in God. Answer his call. It just might change your life. And if you're not sure how to go about doing that, I'd love to help you out. You can pull me aside after church or call me at home, or better yet, you can just come forward now while we all stand and sing together. Let's sing, church.